Sign it, Ethan. My son-in-law's voice echoed through the wedding reception hall so loudly that conversations stopped at nearly every table. 200 guests turned toward us. Crystal glasses hung frozen in midair. The band stopped playing. My daughter Claire stood beside him in her white wedding dress, her smile gone. "Brandon," she whispered, "not now." But he didn't even look at her. He held out a leather folder and pointed at the signature line. "You promised this ranch would stay in the family," he said. "Make it official. Right here. Right now." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. The Walker Ranch had been in my family for almost a century. My father had worked that land. My grandfather had worked that land. Every fence post carried a memory. Every acre held a piece of our family story. "This is my daughter's wedding," I said quietly. "We're not discussing property today." Brandon's jaw tightened. "Then when?" "After you're gone." A nervous murmur spread through the ballroom. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me. Claire stepped forward. "Please stop," she said. "Both of you." But something had already shifted in the room. This wasn't about a wedding anymore. It was about power. It was about greed. And somehow, it had become a public spectacle. If this story speaks to your heart, consider liking and subscribing, but only if it truly resonates with you. And if you're listening right now, leave a comment telling me your city or country and your local time. I always find comfort knowing where people are joining from. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 76 years old, and this was the day that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The day my daughter's wedding became the beginning of a painful truth. Looking back now, I realized the warning signs had been there all along. I just didn't want to see them. The reception was being held at a beautiful venue outside Austin, Texas. I had paid for most of it myself. The flowers, the food, the live band, the custom dance floor with Claire and Brandon's initials engraved in gold. For months, I told everyone it was worth every penny because my daughter deserved the happiest day of her life. Yet as I stood there under the warm glow of the chandeliers, I saw something in Brandon's eyes that made my stomach sink. It wasn't love. It wasn't gratitude. It was expectation. The kind of expectation that comes from believing something already belongs to you. "You owe Claire security," he said. "The ranch should be hers." "The ranch will be handled according to my plans," I replied. "Plans," he laughed. "Or secrets?" That single word hit me harder than he could have known. Secrets. Because there was something Brandon didn't know. Something Claire didn't know. Something almost nobody knew. A secret I had spent 6 months protecting. And at that exact moment, as the guests watched and the tension tightened around us like a rope, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced down at the screen and saw a name I had been waiting to see for a very long time. Suddenly, I realized this wedding was about to become the last place Brandon Hayes ever wanted to be. The name on my phone screen pulled me back through decades of memories before I answered it. Long before Claire met Brandon, long before wedding planners and expensive venues and whispered arguments behind closed doors, there had only been the ranch, my daughter, and me. After Helen passed away 8 years earlier, Claire and I became each other's whole world. I still remembered the small red boots she wore when she was 7 years old, running through the fields after the horses. "Daddy, wait for me," she would shout as her blonde ponytail bounced behind her. I would slow my horse and laugh. "You have to keep up, sweetheart. The cows are not going to wait all day." Back then, she never let go of my hand when we walked through town. Every Friday after school, we stopped at Miller's Diner for chocolate pie. She always ordered the same thing. She always sat in the same booth. "When I grow up, I am never leaving the ranch," she once told me while swinging her legs beneath the table. "I'm going to live right next door to you." I believed her. Maybe that was my first mistake. The years passed, and life changed the way it always does. Claire went to college in Austin. She made new friends. She built a new life. None of that bothered me. What bothered me were the small things that appeared after Brandon entered the picture. At first, he seemed respectful. He called me sir. He offered to help repair fences. He asked questions about cattle and land management. "You built something incredible here, Ethan," he told me one afternoon while we stood near the north pasture. "Most people spend their lives chasing what you already have." At the time, I took that as a compliment. Looking back, I hear those words differently. Then came the little changes. Claire stopped calling every Sunday. Family dinners became less frequent. When I invited them to the ranch, Brandon always seemed to have another plan. "We already promised friends we would be in Dallas this weekend," Claire would explain. Maybe next month. One Christmas, I spent weeks restoring an old rocking horse that had belonged to Claire as a child. I thought it would make a beautiful gift for my future grandchildren someday. Brandon looked at it for 2 seconds before asking, "Do you know how much something like this would sell for?" I laughed politely, but something about the question stayed with me. A few months later, I overheard another conversation that left a mark. They thought I was outside feeding the horses. Through the open kitchen window, I heard Brandon say, "Your father is sitting on millions in land value." Claire answered so softly I could barely hear her. "Please do not talk about him like that." Brandon replied, "I am being realistic." That was the day a small crack appeared in the picture I had been holding together. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself every family has misunderstandings. But the crack kept growing. The phone was still vibrating in my hand as I stood in that crowded reception hall. The caller knew something that nobody else in that room knew. And 6 months earlier, that same person had walked into my life carrying information that would change everything I thought I understood about Brandon Hayes. 6 months before the wedding, I was repairing a section of fence along the western edge of the ranch when a black pickup truck rolled slowly up my gravel driveway. I recognized neither the truck nor the woman who stepped out of it. She looked to be in her late 40s, dressed in a navy blazer despite the Texas heat. She carried a folder tucked under one arm. "Mr. Walker?" she asked. "That is me." She glanced toward the barn before lowering her voice. "My name is Diane Mercer. I work in financial compliance at First Capital Bank in Austin. I know this is unusual, but I believe you need to see something." Most people would have told her to leave. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have done the same. But something in her expression reminded me of a person carrying a burden too heavy to keep. We sat at the old picnic table outside my house. She opened the folder. The first document contained my name. The second contained my ranch. The third contained a signature that looked like mine, but was not. I stared at it. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked. Diane folded her hands. "Someone has been presenting documents connected to your property while attempting to secure financing." The words settled over me slowly. "Who?" She hesitated. "I cannot officially answer that." Then she slid another page across the table. She did not need to answer. The name was already there. Brandon Hayes. For a long moment, I simply sat there listening to the wind move through the oak trees. A younger version of me would have exploded with anger. I would have grabbed the phone immediately. I would have confronted him that very hour. Instead, I surprised even myself. I closed the folder. I thanked Diane for coming. Then I walked her back to her truck. "That is all?" she asked, clearly confused. "You are not going to call him?" I looked across the ranch toward the distant pasture where Claire used to ride horses as a little girl. "Not today," I said. Diane studied me carefully. "Mr. Walker, if there is more going on, you need to be careful." After she left, I sat alone until sunset. That evening Claire called. "Dad, Brandon and I are thinking about stopping by this weekend." Normally I would have jumped at the chance. Instead, I asked a question. "Claire, has Brandon ever talked to you about using the ranch in business deals?" Silence lingered for a moment too long. "Why would you ask that?" she replied. "Just curious." Her answer never came directly. Instead, she changed the subject. That was when I felt it. Not certainty, not proof, just the uncomfortable feeling that pieces were moving behind a curtain I could not yet see. Over the following weeks, something changed inside me. I started paying attention. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed Brandon asking questions he had never asked before. Questions about trusts. Questions about inheritance laws. Questions about mineral rights beneath the property. One afternoon during a family barbecue, he laughed and said, "You know, Ethan, someday this place is going to be worth a fortune." Everyone else laughed politely. I did not. For the first time, I simply looked him in the eye and said nothing. Brandon stopped smiling first. And in that small moment, I think he realized I was no longer the man he thought I was. What he did not realize was that Diane Mercer was not the only person who had contacted me. Because 3 days later, another visitor arrived at the ranch carrying information that made everything far more serious than a simple property dispute. 3 days after Diane Mercer left the ranch, the second visitor arrived just before sunset. It was Samuel Reed, my attorney and oldest friend. I had known Sam for more than 40 years. He was not the kind of man who drove 2 hours without a reason. The moment I saw his face, I knew something was wrong. He carried a thick envelope under his arm and walked straight to my porch. "Ethan," he said quietly, We need to talk." We sat in the same chairs where Helen and I used to drink coffee every morning. Sam placed the envelope on the table between us. "Before I show you this, I need you to promise me something." I nodded. "Do not confront anyone until you see the whole picture." My stomach tightened. Sam opened the envelope and spread several documents across the table. Some were loan applications. Some were property evaluations. Others were legal correspondence. My eyes stopped on one particular page. It listed my ranch as collateral. "This cannot be real," I whispered. "I know," Sam replied, "but it is." According to the documents, Brandon had been presenting himself to multiple investors as the future controlling owner of the property. He had not actually owned a single acre, but he had spoken so confidently that people believed him. Worse, some of those claims had started spreading through business circles in Austin. The lie was growing larger every month. "How many people know about this?" I asked. Sam exhaled slowly. "More than you would like." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The evening wind moved through the trees while my mind replayed years of family dinners, birthdays, and holidays. Suddenly, little moments began fitting together. Questions that once seemed harmless now carried different meanings. Comments I had ignored suddenly sounded deliberate. "There is more," Sam said carefully. Those 4 words landed harder than everything else. He slid another document toward me. It contained emails, messages, meeting notes. My chest felt heavy as I read. Brandon had not been acting alone. Several people already believed the ranch would soon belong to him and Claire. Some had even discussed future development plans. Luxury homes, private roads, commercial projects, decisions about land that was not theirs. "Did Claire know?" I asked. Sam looked away. That silence hurt more than any answer. "I do not know how much she knew," he finally said. "But her name appears in some of these conversations." I stared at the horizon as the last sunlight disappeared. The ranch suddenly felt different. Not because the land had changed, but because the people around it had. The next week brought more surprises. Neighbors began congratulating Brandon on his supposed future ownership. One man at a feed store smiled and said, "Looks like the next generation is taking over." Brandon simply smiled back. He never corrected anyone. He never denied anything. The lie had become useful. The lie had become profitable. And the more it spread, the more people accepted it as truth. That was the moment something inside me finally broke. Not my confidence. Not my spirit. My trust. Because as I sat alone that night reviewing the documents one final time, I turned to the last page in Sam's envelope and discovered a signature that changed everything. The moment I recognized the name written at the bottom, it felt as though the ground beneath my entire family had disappeared. The signature at the bottom of that document belonged to Claire. I stared at it for what felt like an hour, hoping I had misunderstood something, hoping there was another explanation. Sam remained silent across the table. Finally, I looked up. "Are you telling me my daughter signed this?" He chose his words carefully. "I am telling you her name appears on documents connected to these discussions." That distinction mattered, but not enough to ease the weight pressing against my chest. The next morning I called Claire. The phone rang 6 times before she answered. "Hi, Dad." Her voice sounded cheerful, almost rehearsed. "Claire, I need to ask you something important." Silence. "Okay. Have you signed anything related to the ranch?" Another pause. "Why would you ask me that?" It was the second time she had answered a question with a question. "Because I need the truth." I heard Brandon speaking faintly somewhere in the background. Then Claire lowered her voice. "Dad, everything is complicated right now. Maybe we should talk another time." The call ended less than 2 minutes later. I sat staring at my phone long after the screen went dark. That afternoon, I wrote her an email. Not an angry one. Not an accusation. Just a father asking for honesty. I told her I loved her. I told her there was nothing we could not work through if we faced it together. 2 days passed. No response. Then 4. Then 7. Eventually, I received a reply containing only 3 sentences. She said she was busy. She said wedding planning was overwhelming. She said we would talk soon. We never did. Weeks passed. I mailed a handwritten letter. The same way my father used to write to me when I was away. 3 pages. Every word carefully chosen. I included a photograph of Claire at 10 years old standing beside her favorite horse. I thought maybe it would remind her who we used to be. The letter was delivered. I tracked it myself. Yet no answer came. Meanwhile, the stories continued spreading. A supplier congratulated Brandon on future expansion plans. A real estate broker mentioned hearing rumors about luxury development. At church, an acquaintance smiled and said, "Your family must be excited about what comes next." I forced a smile and nodded because explaining the truth felt impossible. The strangest part was watching people believe something simply because enough others repeated it. A lie told often enough begins wearing the clothes of truth. One evening I tried calling Claire again. This time Brandon answered. "She is busy," he said. "Busy for 3 weeks?" I asked. "Wedding season is stressful." His tone remained polite, but there was something underneath it. Confidence. Ownership. As though access to my own daughter now passed through him. After the call ended, I walked outside and sat alone on the porch. The ranch stretched before me exactly as it always had. The cattle moved across the distant pasture. The windmill turned slowly against the sunset. Everything looked familiar, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. The people I loved most seemed farther away than strangers. My calls went unanswered. My letters disappeared into silence. My questions returned without answers. And as darkness settled over the fields that night, I realized I had never felt more alone in my entire life. That winter was the quietest season I had ever lived through. After Helen passed away, I thought I had already experienced the deepest kind of loneliness a person could carry. I was wrong. Grief is painful, but grief still leaves you with memories that feel honest. What I was feeling now was different. It was the slow realization that people I loved were building a future that seemed to have no place for me in it. The ranch house felt larger than it ever had before. Some mornings I would pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit before remembering there was only me. I would catch myself looking toward the driveway whenever a vehicle passed, wondering if Claire might surprise me with a visit. She never did. One evening I sat at the kitchen table, staring at an old photograph of Helen, holding Claire on her lap. Claire could not have been more than 4 years old. Both of them were laughing at something outside the frame. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. "I wish you were here," I said quietly. The empty room offered no answer. A few days later Sam called. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I almost gave him the automatic response. "Fine. Busy. Managing." Instead I told the truth. "I do not recognize my own life right now." There was a pause on the other end. "Then maybe it is time to stop pretending everything is normal." Those words stayed with me, because he was right. For months I had been acting like patience alone would fix everything. I kept believing that one more phone call, one more letter, one more conversation would somehow restore the family I remembered. But families do not heal through denial. The realization was painful, yet strangely freeing. That same week, I received a short text message from Claire. It was the first message she had sent in nearly a month. It read, "Sorry, things have been complicated. We will talk after the wedding." I stared at those 11 words for several minutes. No explanation, no questions, no acknowledgement of the distance growing between us. Just a promise pushed into the future. For the first time, I did not reply immediately. Instead, I set the phone down and walked outside. The sun was setting behind the western pasture. The cattle moved slowly across the hills. The wind carried the familiar smell of dry grass and cedar trees. The ranch had survived droughts, floods, market crashes, and 3 generations of hardship. It was still standing. Maybe I needed to learn from it. Maybe endurance did not mean waiting for rescue. Maybe endurance meant facing reality as it was. Later that night, I opened the locked wooden box Helen had asked me never to forget. Inside were family records, letters, and legal documents she had carefully organized before her death. I had not touched most of them in years. As I sorted through the contents, one envelope caught my attention. My name was written on the front in Helen's handwriting. Beneath it were 6 words that immediately made my heart race. "Open only if you must know." For the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness. I felt the beginning of clarity. I opened Helen's envelope just before midnight. Inside was a letter, several legal documents, and a page covered with notes in her careful handwriting. As I read, I realized she had seen dangers long before I ever had. Helen loved Claire more than life itself, but she also understood something about human nature. She knew that money could change people. She knew that land could attract the wrong kind of attention. Most importantly, she knew that one day I might need protection from the very pressures surrounding our family. The documents confirmed that the ranch had been placed inside a carefully structured trust years earlier. Certain conditions had to be met before ownership could ever change hands. No shortcuts, no promises, no assumptions. Helen had thought of everything. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and walked outside. The air smelled of cedar and fresh grass. The eastern sky glowed orange above the pasture. Instead of sitting alone with my worries, I picked up a hammer and started repairing an old equipment shed that had needed attention for years. Then I repaired a broken gate. The following week, I organized storage rooms that had not been touched since Helen was alive. One project became another, then another. My life slowly began moving forward again. "You have more energy than men half your age," my ranch foreman, Carl Benson, joked one afternoon as we loaded fencing supplies into a truck. I laughed. Maybe I wasted too much time sitting still. Carl nodded toward the fields. "Whatever changed, keep doing it." Word spread through the community that I was expanding operations. I leased an additional grazing section from a neighboring property owner. I upgraded several irrigation systems. I even started a mentorship program for local high school students interested in agriculture. One Saturday morning, a teenager named Mason approached me after helping repair a fence line. "Mr. Walker, how do you know if something is worth fighting for?" he asked. I looked across the ranch before answering. "If it still matters when nobody is watching, it is probably worth protecting." He thought about that for a long moment. I will remember that. Those conversations began happening more often. Without realizing it, I had started building something larger than a ranch. I was rebuilding purpose. People who genuinely cared about the land, the work, and the values behind it began showing up. Not because they wanted something from me, because they wanted to contribute. Months earlier, I had measured life by unanswered phone calls and painful silence. Now my days were filled with movement, progress, direction. Claire still remained distant. The wedding date continued approaching. Yet for the first time, her absence no longer controlled every thought in my head. Then, late one afternoon, Sam Reed arrived carrying a folder and wearing an expression I had not seen before. "You are going to want to sit down for this," he said. "We finally received the financial records we have been waiting for." I set my tools aside. Sam opened the folder. The first page contained numbers. The second contained names. The third contained evidence that connected far more people than either of us had expected. As I stared at the documents, I realized the situation was about to become much bigger than one family disagreement. Sam and I spent the next 3 hours reviewing every page inside that folder. The deeper we looked, the clearer the picture became. What had started as a few suspicious documents had grown into a network of assumptions, promises, and financial projections built around property that nobody had the authority to offer. Yet something unexpected happened as I read through the evidence. Instead of feeling defeated, I felt calm. For months, I had been reacting to uncertainty. Now I finally had facts. Facts do not shout. Facts do not manipulate. Facts simply stand there waiting to be seen. The following weeks changed my routine completely. Sam encouraged me to formalize the mentorship program we had started at the ranch. With help from local educators and agricultural leaders, we transformed it into a regional training initiative for young people interested in livestock management and land stewardship. One morning, I walked into the community center and saw a new sign mounted beside the entrance. It read, Walker Agricultural Leadership Program. Beneath the title was my name, founder and director. I stood there staring at those words longer than I should have. A year earlier, I might have dismissed it as unimportant. Now it represented something different. Purpose. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker," a young instructor named Emily said as she approached. "You built something people believe in." I smiled. "A lot of good people helped." "Maybe," she replied, "but somebody had to lead." That afternoon, more than 60 students attended the first official orientation. As I stood in front of the room, I noticed something surprising. The nervousness I expected never arrived. Instead, I felt confidence. Not because I had all the answers, but because I finally trusted myself again. "The land will teach you patience," I told the group. "Animals will teach you responsibility. Hard work will teach you character. The question is whether you are willing to listen." The room became silent. Every student was paying attention. Afterwards, several parents introduced themselves. Local business owners offered support. Community leaders asked about future partnerships. One county commissioner even approached me near the exit. "Ethan, this program could become one of the most important things our county has seen in years." Those words stayed with me during the drive home. For the first time in a long time, people were not looking at me as a landowner. They were looking at me as a builder, a teacher, a leader. The ranch continued thriving as well. New contracts were signed. Operations expanded. The future no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like something I was actively shaping. Then one evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the western pasture, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen in months. Claire. I stared at the screen before answering. Hello, I said quietly. There was a long pause. Then I heard her voice. Dad, I think we need to talk. As I listened, I realized the past and present were finally about to collide. And only days later, standing inside that crowded reception hall, I would remember this call and understand exactly why it mattered. Claire called me 2 days before the wedding. I was standing beside a newly repaired fence line when her name appeared on my screen. For a moment, I simply looked at it. Then I answered, Hello, sweetheart. The silence that followed felt heavy. Dad, she said quietly, can we meet? We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop outside Austin, the same place where she used to stop with me after livestock auctions when she was a teenager. When I arrived, she was already there. She looked tired, not physically tired, emotionally tired. She wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee she barely touched. You look good, she said. So do you. It was a lie. We both knew it. For several minutes we talked about safe subjects. The weather, wedding details, travel plans. Neither of us mentioned the real reason we were there. Finally, Claire looked down at the table. Dad, if there are things being said about the ranch, I need you to know I never wanted any problems. I studied her face carefully. That is not what I asked. She swallowed hard. Then what are you asking? I am asking whether you know everything that has been happening. Her eyes filled with uncertainty. Not guilt, not confidence. Uncertainty. That told me more than any answer could have. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and immediately straightened in her chair. I should go. Claire. She stopped. Yes. Whatever happens next, remember that I love you. Her expression changed. For the briefest moment, I saw the little girl from the ranch again. Then the moment passed. She left. I sat there alone for a long time. By the day of the wedding, I knew more than anyone realized. Sam knew. Diane knew. A few others knew. Most importantly, the people investigating the financial records knew. The pieces were finally in place. Back in the reception hall, hundreds of guests filled the room. Conversations had quieted. The music had stopped. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across polished floors. Nobody understood how much had already changed. Months earlier, I had felt powerless. Months earlier, I had been chasing answers. Now I possessed something far stronger. Certainty. My phone was still in my hand. The call I had been waiting for had already arrived. Across the room, I noticed Sam entering through a side doorway carrying a familiar leather case. A few moments later, another guest arrived. Then another. None of them attracted attention at first. That was the point. Brandon continued speaking confidently, unaware that control had already slipped from his hands. Well, he asked from across the room. What are you going to do? I looked around the ballroom. I saw Claire. I saw Sam. I saw faces that had repeated rumors for months. Faces that believed a future built on assumptions. Then I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Nothing, I said calmly. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Brandon smiled. He thought he had won. He thought the silence belonged to him. What he did not know was that the people who had just entered the room were carrying documents, records, and answers that would change everything. And as the ballroom doors slowly opened once more, every conversation stopped. The ballroom doors opened, and 3 people stepped inside. None of them raised their voices. None of them rushed. Yet the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Sam Reed walked at the center carrying his leather case. Beside him was Diane Mercer. Behind them came a gray-haired man in a dark suit whom very few guests recognized. I did. Brandon did too. His confidence vanished for a fraction of a second before he recovered. What is this? He asked. Sam stopped several feet away. Information, he replied calmly. The room remained silent. Claire looked from one face to another. Dad, what is happening? I met her eyes. The truth is finally catching up. Brandon laughed, but it sounded forced. This is ridiculous. The gray-haired man opened a folder. My name is Richard Holloway. I represent a group of investors whose names appear in these records. Several guests exchanged nervous looks. Richard continued. Over the past year, multiple presentations, projections, and financial discussions were conducted using property interests that did not belong to the individuals presenting them. Brandon stepped forward. That does not prove anything. Actually, Diane said quietly, it proves quite a lot. She placed several documents on a nearby table. These records show repeated claims regarding future ownership arrangements that were never authorized. Nobody spoke. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Claire stared at the pages. Brandon, she whispered, tell me they are wrong. He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Sam removed another document from his case. There is something else everyone should understand. He turned toward the guests. The ranch is protected by a trust established years ago. No private promise, assumption, or expectation can override its legal structure. A murmur spread across the room. For months, people had been operating under one version of reality. In less than 5 minutes, that version was collapsing. I remained where I was. Calm, quiet, watching. Brandon looked at me. You planned this. No, I answered. I prepared for it. The difference landed harder than any accusation. Claire lowered herself into a chair. She looked exhausted. Dad, she said softly, you knew? I knew enough to start asking questions. Tears gathered in her eyes. Not because someone had defeated her, because she was realizing how much had happened without her understanding it. Richard opened the final folder. There is one more matter. His voice was steady, professional. Several communications indicate that certain individuals believed future control was already guaranteed. Those statements directly influenced financial decisions involving substantial sums of money. Brandon went pale. The room seemed to shrink around him. For the first time all evening, nobody was looking at him with admiration. Nobody was following his lead. The center of gravity had shifted completely. Then Claire reached toward the documents with trembling hands. As she turned the final page, her eyes locked onto a signature and a date. A second later, she looked up at Brandon as though she were seeing a stranger. You told me this never existed, she whispered. Claire continued staring at the document as though the words might change if she looked long enough. They did not. The signature, the dates, the records, everything remained exactly where it had been when Richard Holloway placed the folder on the table. Around us, the ballroom stayed remarkably quiet. 200 guests had become witnesses to something none of them expected. Brandon, Claire said softly, answer me. He looked at the papers, then at her, then at me. For the first time all evening, he seemed unable to find the right words. Richard stepped forward. These records came directly from financial disclosures, investor communications, and archive correspondence obtained through legal review. His voice remained calm and professional. Nothing here appeared by accident. Sam nodded. Every document was verified independently. Claire closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was sadness in them, but also clarity. You told me these discussions were informal, she said. You told me nothing was being presented as final. Brandon finally spoke. I was trying to build our future. By speaking for people who never gave permission, she asked. He had no answer. One by one, the assumptions holding everything together began falling away. Several guests quietly stepped back from conversations they had once repeated with confidence. Others avoided eye contact altogether. It was a strange thing to watch. Rumors had spread quickly. Truth moved more slowly, but when it arrived, it carried weight. Claire turned toward me. Dad, I should have asked more questions. I took a slow breath. Maybe, but asking questions is not the same as carrying responsibility for choices you did not make. Tears formed in her eyes. I am sorry. The old version of me would have rushed to repair everything in that moment. He would have ignored his own hurt to make everyone else comfortable. But I had changed. I love you, I said. That has never changed. But some things need time. She nodded. I think she understood. Across the room, Brandon looked smaller than he had an hour earlier. Not because anyone attacked him. Not because anyone humiliated him. The facts simply left less room for illusion. He approached me carefully. Ethan, perhaps we should discuss this privately. I met his gaze. No, the word was quiet. Firm. Final. He looked surprised. No. For months, decisions were discussed without me. Assumptions were made without me. Plans were built without me. I am not interested in private conversations anymore. Sam stood beside me without saying a word. I appreciated that. Boundaries do not need speeches. They only need consistency. As guests slowly began leaving, The ballroom felt strangely empty despite the number of people still inside. Claire remained seated, staring at the documents. Brandon stood alone near a table by the windows. The wedding celebration everyone had planned no longer existed in the form they expected, yet something remained unfinished. As I gathered my jacket, my phone vibrated again. A message appeared from Diane Mercer. It contained only one sentence. "There is another file you have not seen yet." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I looked back toward Claire. Whatever came next was going to affect more than one future. 6 months later, the ranch felt different. Not because the land had changed, but because I had. The final file Diane sent contained additional records that answered the last remaining questions. Some relationships ended. Some business partnerships disappeared. Several people quietly stepped away from plans that had never belonged to them in the first place. What surprised me most was not the loss. It was the peace that followed. Claire and I did not repair everything overnight. Real healing rarely works that way. Instead, we started with small things. A phone call, a shared meal, a conversation without defensiveness. One Saturday morning she arrived at the ranch before sunrise. We stood together beside the old fence line watching the cattle move through the morning fog. "I wish I had asked better questions," she said. I nodded slowly. "We all wish that about something." She smiled sadly. "Are you angry?" I looked out across the pasture before answering. "Not anymore." And for the first time, I realized it was true. Anger had carried me through confusion. Boundaries had carried me through recovery. But forgiveness was what finally allowed me to move forward. The mentorship program continued growing. New students arrived every season. The ranch remained protected. The trust Helen created continued doing exactly what she intended it to do. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth through other people's expectations. That may have been the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes the people closest to us forget who we are. Sometimes they become distracted by fear, ambition, money, or pressure. But their confusion does not have to become our identity. One of the hardest truths I learned is that love without boundaries eventually becomes permission. And permission without accountability eventually becomes harm. Looking back now, I believe God was working long before I understood what was happening. Not by removing every difficulty, not by preventing every disappointment, but by giving me the wisdom to see clearly when the time finally came. If you are listening to this story and carrying your own disappointment, your own betrayal, or your own loneliness, I want you to hear something from a 76-year-old rancher who learned it the hard way. Protect your heart. Protect your finances. Protect your peace. Ask questions when something feels wrong. Trust your instincts. And never allow another person's opinion to define your value. You do not need to become bitter to become strong. You do not need revenge to reclaim your dignity. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stand still and refuse to surrender who you are. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 76 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never trade your self-respect for someone's approval. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening to my story. Wherever you are in the world today, I hope you know that setbacks are not the end of your story. Sometimes they are the beginning of your freedom. As the sun set that evening, Claire handed me an old photograph she had found while cleaning her attic. It showed a little girl in red boots standing beside her father near a weathered fence. We both smiled. Then we placed the photograph back inside Helen's wooden box and closed the lid together. The ranch stretched quietly beneath the golden Texas sky, and I realized that the things worth keeping are never the things we own, but the truths we choose to live by. If this story meant something to you, I hope you will share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, and spend more time with us. There are many more stories ahead about family, resilience, second chances, and the lessons life teaches when we least expect them. Somewhere in those stories, you may find a piece of your own journey. And until then, remember this. Sometimes the strongest fence you will ever build is the boundary that protects your own soul.